Hey everybody, welcome to Popular Culture Week 4. Let's talk about race and music. Alright, so I want to talk about Paul Gilroy today. He is an important popular culture scholar and he's obviously written a lot, and today I want to focus on the idea of race and music and how we can sort of assess those things and think about those things in more detail. I think in many ways this can apply to other studies like with gender, sexuality, or what have you. So keep that in mind, that we're looking specifically at race, and for the most part I want to talk about African Americans, which is obviously relevant to America. He was British, and so it was slightly different but still very similar in terms of how these things worked. And in terms of international pop culture, we're talking about the same people, right? So I want to just start with this idea of taking the pulse of the people. I like that as a metaphor. There's a album, if you want to check it out, that's pretty good, by Dead Prez, the group, called Pulse of the People. But as a metaphor, I think we understand on a basic level what that means, right? To take the pulse of the people. But why do we say that, or how did that come to be? I want you to think about that. So I'm sure if you're an athlete, or if you've just taken a basic health class, you know how to take your pulse, and you can, if you have a Fitbit like I do, you can actually see it. So right now, I guess because I'm starting to talk and stand and all that, in the low 80s. But I mean, why do we take our pulse in general in terms of health? Not because it tells us that much specifically, but because, if my heart rate just standing was in the high hundreds or something, I would know that I was probably unhealthy or something. If it was super low, like in the 30s, I would know that I was, something was wrong in terms of my health. And so it's a quick gauge that doctors often, or nurses usually, look at, because if it's in a certain range, you know that you're probably okay, or at least there's no sign that you're not okay. Whereas if it's really high or really low, you know that we should investigate further, right? Because there could be many things that make your heart rate go high or low. But if we see that your heart rate is too high or low, we know that, okay, we need to do the following tests, or we need to look further into that. And I like that as a metaphor, and I want you to think for a minute, how would you take the pulse of the people metaphorically by listening to music, or by checking out what artists, musicians, and popular entertainers are doing? I think if you can think about that metaphor, right, you look for symptoms like a heart rate, or a pulse, but that just indicates that there's something else behind, right? Like a fever, for example, same thing. You take a fever if you're a doctor or a nurse, and that doesn't tell you what's wrong with the person, but it indicates that you need certain further tests and that other things probably aren't relevant, right? So it kind of pushes you in the right direction, and it's a symptom of something underlying. In many ways, we can read pop music in a similar way. And so I want to talk about what was going on in the civil rights era in the 60s, 70s, and so on, and how that continues, and we can see the same or similar things today. But there's a specific issue that Gilroy is addressing in the excerpt, and it's really about the negotiation of how particularly black artists, black musicians, singers, songwriters, had to negotiate both obviously being black and representing, whether they wanted to or not, black culture in a way that's very different than, say, a white artist at the time, right? So if the Rolling Stones go out and perform something, nobody's saying like, oh, this is a good move for white musicians, right? They don't have to represent themselves as being a voice for white men, because there's so many and it's so prominent already. That's not the same. But when Sam Cooke, for example, or Miles Davis, or somebody who is, sort of breaking ground in a musical way, in a genre especially, stands up as a black man in that case, or Aretha Franklin, you have the ability to speak on behalf of a group that isn't often represented well, or especially during the civil rights moment, that just by virtue of being black, by the shade of your skin, you represent a group of people whether you want to or not. And so he is thinking about how we negotiate that, and how, they didn't want to come across because there's a weird thing in pop music that we started to address with Adorno, right? They didn't want to come across as too out there, because we've already kind of talked about how we say that we want unique artistic voices, right? But we actually, when you break it down, the industry, the pop music industry, might look a little bit more like a car factory, right? Where they give you what you expect, and they paint it a little differently, or they add a new bell or whistle. But for the most part, if somebody came out with 100% new car, like something we've never seen, it's not likely we would buy it, and the infrastructure isn't there to help push that out. Whereas if somebody just wants to change the paint color, or if somebody wants to make the steering wheel like a little bigger or smaller or something, right? These are changes that are more likely to be made from year to year. Similarly, you want something new or fresh, and that's always like, hey, this is a cool, fresh, new sound. But if it's too new or fresh, then people often don't gravitate towards it, especially when it comes to popular stuff. And so, in a similar way, these artists who were effectively just, again, by virtue of their race, of the racial characteristics of the UK or the US, they spoke for a certain group. They had to speak for that group, but they also didn't want to come across as militant or as way out there, because that would, among other things, really hurt their ability to gain a space in pop music. So, for example, I want to talk, like we did before, about what's a difficult passage in this reading, what's a beautiful passage, what makes the most sense to you, what maybe do you challenge or would you challenge if you were having a dialogue with him. One thing I like that I want to think about a little bit is that he says, the privileged position which flowed from enjoying a public voice was used by artists to blend the contradictory elements of the Black Power movement into an uneasy unity and to create an anti-racist current among whites, particularly the young. And so that might sound actually quite familiar then to you and to your experience today listening to certain music. I'm sure you can think of some people that maybe have been criticized today who are maybe too vocal about things like Black Power or whatever, maybe Black Lives Matter today, right? And so some people have embraced that, other people have said, this is not the place where we should be discussing that or something, right? So whether you want to or not, and I think a lot of musical performers are not in it so that they can talk politics, but by virtue of representing a group, you kind of have to, and if you don't talk politics, then that's kind of saying, I agree with the system, right? And agreeing with the system in many ways is agreeing with racism as opposed to anti-racism. And so it's difficult, and we can see this, I think, most prominently. One of the things I want to talk about, and I want you to just think about with the videos that are posted as well, is that you have early representations of sort of ghetto culture or street culture from New York, the Bronx, and these places, right? You have the beginnings of hip-hop with Kool Herc and Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five and The Message and all this stuff, right? So you have this really vocal, this is coming after some of the groups, by the way, that Paul Gilroy talks about, but I think you can trace the continuation, right? And that's what I want you to think about a little bit. So you have these groups that clearly represent a sort of urban minority culture, African American for the most part culture, low income culture, and ironically, again, they gain the most traction, especially as we go into the 80s and 90s, with white suburban youth. And so there's always this sort of weird political blend where you have NWA, right, representing Compton, but also appealing to the privileged groups that they're maybe fighting against, right? Those are the ones that are buying the CDs more and that are listening to it more and that are problematically enough often repeating lyrics and things like that. So there's this weird trend that I think is sort of perfectly highlighted in this Jimmy Fallon and Justin Timberlake video that I'm posting. I want you to listen to what they're doing, and I want you to think about the politics involved. Because again, I don't think that Jimmy Fallon or Justin Timberlake had in mind that they wanted to make a political statement. I think they just wanted to, I think you could argue that they just wanted to sing some of their favorite songs or something. But what's happening here in terms of the message and the context, because that is how we can sort of take the pulse of the people, right? So if you think about early, I'm going to post this as well, Grandmaster Flash, think about what that expresses and the kind of message that you're gaining or that you might be receiving from that. And again, you also have to think about your own position, right? If that looks familiar to you, which I doubt because I'm teaching in rural Georgia right now. So, but if that experience looked familiar to you, you'd see one thing. If that experience looked completely different than your own experience, then you're going to read it in a different way. But regardless, you're getting this message, which is literally called the message, the song, and you're reading it in a certain way with your own context and your cultural capital and your understanding of how the world works. You're also, however, reading it many decades afterwards, and that's sort of what Justin Timberlake and Jimmy Fallon represent, is a reading that's kind of taking these songs by low-income African American communities, or representing low-income African American communities, and representing it to I won't say too much about it, but I want you to pay attention to the audience at the end of the clip, right? What's going on and how are these messages changing over time and space or geography, and how can we better understand what's going on? That's what I want you to basically think about. I don't think we could talk for days about this, but that's the crux of what I want you to think about this week. So if you read Gilroy and you think about the civil rights movement, I want you to think about how race and issues of political representation and challenging the establishment versus also kind of placating it so that you don't become outcast and therefore not able to send your message. So that difficult negotiation for people during that time and how that's changed and progressed up until today. If you can start to think about that, you can look for specific things, right? So again, not to belabor the point, but if I take my pulse, which is right now, I wonder if it's gone up or down. Yeah, it's in the low 90s now because I've been speaking and breathing a little differently, I think. So I could look at that and say, okay, well, his heart must be going faster now, right? That indicates certain other factors. And so if you look at the music as a symptom and you think, what's going on beneath the surface that I can better understand using perhaps earlier works like Adorno's, definitely Paul Gilroy, then I want you to try to unpack what's going on here. Read the symptom, which is the surface level, and try to ask yourself what might be the cause or underlying causes that allow, for example, these two wealthy white men to be singing the same lyrics as these other groups, and what's the difference and how does that work in our culture? I think, hopefully, after reading Gilroy especially, you'll come up with some interesting responses. So that's all I want you to think about. We're continuing in the same vein of reading something challenging from a particular time, from a particular perspective, agreeing or not agreeing with it, but asking yourself, what's difficult about this? What do I need to re-ask? Or maybe I need to send a message to Chris and ask, I think I understand this, but can you explain this a little bit more? Can you tell me if I'm on the right track? Feel free to do that. I want you to think about that and then apply it to today or to maybe your own experience. And that's how we better understand our culture. So on one level, it's pretty simple. It's like taking your pulse. But on another level, obviously, it's much more complicated and nuanced. And some people might see different things, and that's okay. As long as you back up and support your argument. And make sure you check out the other video I'm posting right now on the assignment, the pop music analysis assignment, because we're going to talk in more depth about that.